You've met me, I'm Jim Van Patten. I work at a little company called Roost. We make those smart home devices and that battery that nobody knows what it is. Before that, I was at Logitech for 4 years. I was the VP of Quality, which is where the FMEA stuff came from. Before that, I worked in automotive for 25 years as a lean manufacturing consultant, so that's where the Muda came from.
I'm Cindy Eldridge. I work for Avnet Electronics, a global distributor. I've been in electronic distribution all of my working career, 25 plus years, and I've had the pleasure of working with all sizes of OEM and contract manufacturing customers.
My name is Theo Wu. I'm the president and CEO of Meritronics. So I have been in the EMS business for over 25 years, and I was born actually in Taiwan when I was actually assembling the first like a clone IBM PCs in Taiwan back then. And I moved to the US, and then I joined Selectron, and then we actually started the SMT process in Selectron. We were actually start learning how to do SMT backend, okay? And then I see all the changes, and all this industry change. So glad to have you everyone here. And then so now Meritronics has an assembly operation in California, Las Vegas, and also China. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shirish Joshi. I'm an independent consultant and have worked with PRG for almost a year now. I started my career in the Valley way back when with Sun Microsystems, and that's where we first started what we called outsourcing, which then also became offshoring in some cases, right? And one of our first partners at that time, back in 1986, was Selectron. And we were co-located actually for a while. Selectron was in the back of our building, so we would build our PCBAs at Selectron and hand it across the fence to our systems assembly plant, right? And then slowly but surely, Selectron took those same boards and moved them offshore because it became more expensive to manufacture in the US. Since then, I've worked at Apple, Silicon Graphics, Quantum, the tape drive division, did several startups, and thought I'd spend a little bit more time in working for myself. So that's where I am, and happy to be here.
So the first question, and we're going to go down the line from OEM all the way to industry expert. What trends are you seeing for manufacturing offshore versus onshore these days? There's a lot of talk, recently. What are the latest trends that you're seeing? Let's start with Jim.
Sure. I guess I see two things. One is there is a consolidation going on that from some of the contract manufacturers in China. They're not immune to that. And so that will add some short-term confusion as that gets sorted out. There's another trend, which is location, that the Chinese government is encouraging companies to move inland. And so what they call the South and the East is very well industrialized. A lot of manufacturing. It's very well developed. Inside China, Wuhan is not so well developed. And so they're encouraging companies to open up inside. What that means for us is that you can't fly to Hong Kong and go to Shenzhen to your manufacturer anymore. Now they're in the middle of nowhere, and or soon will be, and it's going to add even more difficulty just traveling to whoever's making your parts. So I think that will probably continue. Part of that is also the opening up of Malaysia and Thailand, Vietnam. I've done some supplier audits in those, and they are coming online pretty strongly. I would expect companies to be very attractive, and there are pockets in those countries now that are very well developed. So I'm looking down there. That's a location.
I'll give you a slightly different perspective. I deal with a lot of startups, and what I'm seeing almost universally is startups reconsidering that immediate migration to Asia. and are now taking an approach where they're recognizing that there's value. And a lot of the things that Jim talked about in his presentation, there's value in starting that pre-production manufacturing either in the US or they're considering Mexico. Right along with that though, depending on what that end product is and if it's a consumer product, frankly it's going to need to go production manufacturing in Asia, so they're looking at manufacturing partners that have a footprint that would enable them to manufacture the pre-production boards here and then have a smooth migration path to a partner location in somewhere in Asia. So that's definitely one trend that I'm seeing almost universally with all the startups that I touch. The other is pretty much across the board, startups as well as established OEM customers have made a conscious decision to take back control of their supply base. And what I mean by that is I'm finding that customers have recognized, the OEMs have recognized that there's value in them controlling their most critical devices. And a lot of this ties into what Jim was saying about risk, and this goes into component risk, because if you know that channel of support, you know where those products are coming from, you have confidence that there's a supply chain built behind your forecasted demand, and it really does reduce the risk when you ultimately make that decision to manufacture offshore. So when I think about trends, those are probably two of the most significant trends that I'm experiencing.
Okay, so from my point of view is we do EMS service to our customers. So what I'm seeing right now is because the new president that he keeps threatening the new tax duty for the imports. So a lot of companies are actually looking to have the product manufactured in the US more than before. And also another reason is China, the cost of China labor is getting higher and higher now. So when we first set up our China factory, the ratio of our quotation to our customer is about 1 to 6. Okay, so if it's a $1 to build in China, in the US would be $6. Okay, but now the US will be $6 and China will be about $2. So you're only saving a little bit on the labor, and also depend on your product. If your product is very populated with a lot of electronics components, a lot of automation, then then it's probably not as high motivation for you to go to China, because you have to risk a lot of counterfeit part issue or the long logistic, and then the long lead time. So by saving the small part of the labor, but you have to actually add a lot of cost to your overall supply. So a lot of people are reconsidering that, and the shipping cost is getting higher and higher. The FedEx and UPS always try to add more cost to the shipping, so it's really not good, for our customer to build the product in China when you don't have that kind of consistent volume. And then another big reason also, I'm from Taiwan, but we're still friends with China, right? So I see why China is getting so powerful, because they have so much money. The government is so rich, okay? And then your U.S. government, it worry about being shut down, okay? So the China government is so rich because they have so much, collect so much duty import, okay? So if you don't have the time to apply for the import handbook, guess what? You have to pay your product gets stuck at custom, right? Then you pay the VAT, which is 17% plus the duty, okay? So duty could be like 25%. So when you end up you saving a little bit labor, but you have to pay 35 to 40% of the parts cost to import into China. If you don't have time to apply for the handbook takes about a month to do it. And every time you make a change for your design, you gotta reapply for the handbook. So if you don't have that kind of stable design and very clear forecast, then and your product is a high mix and low volume, it doesn't make sense to do in China at all. Okay, so that's my opinion. Thank you.
So in terms of looking at some of the trends, I think most of my colleagues have already touched upon some of the key items. But if you look at, and just going outside, if you will, from the electronics industry and looking across the overall products that we build, There are certain trends that you see happening month after month, and that is the heavier industry, if you will, is moving more and more manufacturing back into the country, and worse into Mexico, right? And primarily because of logistics costs. You know, logistics costs have tripled and quadrupled over the last 10 years, and moving heavy machinery, car parts, automobiles, all of that is becoming more and more expensive, right? So if you look at that industry, that there is certainly a trend to bring it onshore. If you take a cut at the electronics industry, while we know that labor is fairly cheap in Asia, and I don't necessarily mean China, but multiple parts of Asia, there are certain factors connected to the end-to-end aspects of the supply chain, which is, you know, you still have to build the part, you still have to package it, and you still have to ship it to your end customer. And quite often, especially in the retail and IoT space, a lot of packaging is done in Asia. And guess what happens? You know, when you transport it, you're actually transporting volumetric weight, right? So you're transporting a lot of air. A lot of times you end up shipping, you know, by air freight, and all these boxes, you know, have almost 50% air in it. The product is very, very small, right? So you end up paying a lot more in terms of transportation costs. So one of the trends I see happening is that people are building in Asia and then bulk shipping products into the US and doing the final configuration and the pack out and the kitting, even though the labor cost is a little bit higher, right? The one thing it also gives you as an advantage is if there are forecast changes, configuration changes, product mix changes, you can handle it a lot closer to the end customer. So those are kind of some of the things I've been seeing over the last 4 to 5 years. Right?
What key factors do you consider for manufacturing onshore versus offshore?
I had a conversation with one of the shoe manufacturers in Boston, probably 15 years ago. I'm from Boston. And he was the only one that was making athletic shoes in the United States outside of Boston. Everyone else was overseas. And I asked him, how is it that you're able to do this and nobody else can do it? And he said, we design them to make them here. I didn't do that on purpose. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, overseas, what makes these shoes so important is that all the little fiddly stuff that you've got to do, all the little sewing and the little decorations and all that. You look at our shoes, we've designed all that out. We've designed them to make them here. And so deciding to manufacture in the United States starts at design. You make a decision up front and say, we want to make it here. How do we design all the fiddly handwork out? All the little stuff we've got to do, all the box build where we're adding a little of this or gluing a little of that, and designing for automation. So that's where it starts. You decide as a company, we want to do it here. It's very tough to come in after the fact when you've got these really, well, I call them fiddly, when you've got all this little handwork that you've got to do that is so expensive to do here. Doesn't mean you can't go back in and start to design a lot of that out, which is what we're doing at Roost now, is getting rid of as much of that as we can and coming up with ways of automating it. Our goal is to make our products here. It sounds like I'm trying to go from China to Malaysia. That's not the point. Until we can design them and get them to the point where we can make them here efficiently, then we can't do that yet. But that's our goal. So I would say the big thing is are we designed to do it here first? If we are, then the decision's been made over.
So when I think about considerations for onshore and offshore, I really think about a lot of the things that Jim talked about in his presentation. And depending on where you're at, if you're a startup or you're established OEM, I think there's slightly different considerations, because very early on, you need to think about time to market and the risk associated with getting your product delivered on time so that you don't lose that competitive window. And part of that is the risk associated in the parts themselves. You really need partners that can help you identify risk in a bill of materials. You need to consider your supply channel so that you can control where the parts are coming from, and you understand that you have a supply channel directly back to the manufacturers. You also need to consider just the associated costs of transit. A lot of the things Jim spoke about already. I think that those are absolutely considerations that are critical when you're launching your first products, as well as understanding when you go into full production. It's really about risk of the parts themselves, it's about supply assurance, and it's also about aligning with partners that can help you hold on to your capital and use other partners' working capital to help give you the flexibility that you need for upside or even downside support.
So I always advise my customers that to look at like total cost of ownership for what you're looking for, because a new product introduction usually takes quite some time to get to where you need it, right? So just purely saying you want to do onshore or offshore right away, it doesn't do a clean cut, because normally we advise customers to do kind of hybrid, right? So you do some manufacturing of your components in China, like example, like plastic injection molding, right? If you do the molding in the US, usually it's about 2-3 times more expensive for to just get a mold, right? The mold is usually one of the most expensive investment you have for the product. And then a lot of product, because so much manufacturing already moved to China, and actually the same problem we have in Taiwan too. A lot of Taiwan manufacturers moved to China. So there's no manufacturer can provide that kind of service for you here locally, right? If you try to find somebody can do like a gold plating for your or anodizing the product for you, yeah, you can find that people do aerospace, right? Do medical product. They will cost you arm and leg, right? So those kind of stuff you're not gonna be able to afford to buy if your product is for consumer product or close to that kind of pricing target that you're looking for. So I always advise customers to do more like a hybrid. So you look at your ownership for your first, say, 500 units, right? And in some of the total cost, like what Jim talked about, that a lot of shipping costs, logistics, and sending one engineer to China will cost you probably about $5,000 every time, right? The airline, hotels, and he stay one week there, eat there, and so entertainment. So it's gonna cost you probably $5,000 per person, right? So if it's only need to 500 pieces, then they add you $10 per unit to the cost, right? So that's why we set up our China manufacturing facility, so our customer can come to here. We can cut a mold or do get those low cost components from China, ship it over here, and then we do the integration, like what Cindy talked about. Have this kind of capability, do the local MPI production, small volume prototyping, MPI, and you work out all the kinks and bugs. And while your software guy can still continue to work on it. And even the first production run, you may want to consider running in the US. But if you want to decide to do the first production in China, that's fine. But you have to just be prepared to send a team to China when they do the ramp up, because you need to be there to do the approval, right? You don't want to end up have a whole bunch of product that built wrong, not what you're looking for, and sometimes could be as simple as like, hey, the plastic a little scratch on it, I don't want that little tiny scratch. But if you don't have people there to do the approval, no one can approve for you, right? You have to be someone there to do it for you. So I think that's one of my opinions. Thank you.
So in adding some of my thoughts to what Dior was just saying, I think really understanding the product, the components of the product, what the product mix actually comprises of, is I think very critical at the early stage. I think when you're this way, when you're faced with bringing a product to market that the street price is going to be $299, $199, you're always struggling with cost, right? So, but even in that, you have to look at the product mix and the components of the products and say how much of that is actually electronic components, how much of that is labor and assembly, and how much of that is fabricated parts. So in adding to what Dior was saying, plastics are very expensive to build here, right? Sheet metal, die casting, fabrication, PCBs are very expensive to build in the US. So the natural progression of that is to have a hybrid model. So in considering offshoring and onshoring, looking at the product, the quantity of fabricated components in the product, the costs associated with that, then of course there is labor and so on. I think looking at all those mixes is pretty important. The second thing, and this is something that I did at my previous company, was we were building a very complicated box, which is about $20,000 in cost. We chose to build the PCB and the PCB assembly overseas, but we decided to bring all the components back into the US for final assembly and test because it was a very complicated product. For me to fly 4 engineers to China or Malaysia or Singapore every time we had a problem was rather difficult. Working the early kinks out of it and then sustaining that product over its life cycle in the local area where I could drive down to Sunnyvale was a lot simpler. So we, again, built a hybrid model. We got the best of both worlds in some cases, and so we decided to make the split that way. So looking at the product, looking at the mix, kind of assessing the risk factors, and again, I think Jim touched upon it a little bit earlier. One of the things we have kind of underplayed a little bit is language barriers can add a lot to the complexity of the equation, okay? Going to Singapore, Malaysia, and we started offshoring in Singapore. That was the first frontier, basically, when China was still behind closed doors. The next progression was Malaysia, then Thailand, and so on. Language issues there are a lot simpler to overcome. English is the official language of Malaysia and Singapore. Translating documents doesn't have to be done to Chinese. Having a phone call is much easier. So considering all those risk factors is important because if your product is really complicated, it makes the equation a lot more challenging.
Last one, when manufacturing offshore, what are contributors, what do you consider to be contributors for total cost of ownership? And I think, Jim, you went through several, so maybe we'll do kind of an abbreviated, yeah.
So from a total cost of ownership, I want to touch on something that Suresh was saying. I think there's a lot of value in not only considering hybrid or blended models in a finished product environment, but also in a PCBA environment. And what I've seen that has contributed to total cost of ownership, ironically enough, and it's absolutely counterintuitive, is we all believe that we will get the best price for a component in Asia. And I will tell you that that's not always the case. Many of the technology parts suppliers will still offer better pricing in the US. So that complicates the manufacturing strategy, particularly if you've made a decision to manufacture your boards offshore. So what's evolved is these blended models where some components absolutely need to be controlled from the US. And you need to understand that because it absolutely plays into the total cost of ownership of your board. So that's just one piece that I didn't touch on before. From a broader perspective, I think it really gets down to managing price and risk. Price, risk, and supply assurance. So you need to consider those things. It's not all about just the lowest price of labor in Asia, and frankly, even though labor rates are higher in the US, there's data that would tell you that manufacturing in Mexico is now almost at par with China. And as Jim had said, the labor rates are certainly going down the further you go inland, but again, that's a consideration. So I guess at a high level, I would say you need to make an educated, you need to be informed of what the risks are and how business is different. One other point I'll make, then I'll pass it on to Dior, is I have found that when you look at your components, there are pretty standard classifications here. You have parts that are factory stated, non-cancelable, non-returnable. You have parts that are considered very standard and would afford you as a customer zero risk when your forecast changes, as it will. Over in Asia, it's very different. Parts that we would consider as common parts, even things like capacitors, resistors, standard semiconductor products, have a high level of risk because the stocking and procurement strategies are different. So you need to understand that as well. When you are engaging with the contract manufacturers early on, you need to understand that And you also need to make sure that your supply base is aligned with partners that can offset some of that risk and assume it. And it kind of goes back to the comment that I made earlier about aligning with partners that can use their working capital to allow you to use your cash for further investment.
I think I just want to point out a couple things on the electronics component side. If you go look at the, let's say, DigiKey in the US and the DigiKey China, and it's exactly 17% more in China. Okay, so that's a VAT, right? 17% VAT in China. Okay, and so many customers ask me, why your price is the electronics component the same, here in China? Because we actually make a negotiation in the US, and some of the part we make negotiation in our Taiwan office, but we're so afraid of the component in China because they get counterfeited. And even the capacitor register, we have counterfeit capacitors, happen to us because the mentality of the China distributors, they think they know a lot, okay, but in reality they don't, okay. So they will see a component, they quote to you, they say 20 weeks lead time, right? And it's a very special power resistor capacitor, and they say, oh yeah, I got one, they say I can have it for 1 week, right? So guess what? They counterfeit everything, packaging, everything, even a capacitor at a 1% capacitor. But maybe it's okay for your design, but maybe it's not, right? Because one of the key factor maybe is, will cause a problem for your product. Okay, so for their mentality is usually, it's good enough. Okay, it's okay, it's good enough. But a lot of times they don't understand the quality requirement in the US a lot higher. That's why you go to China, you buy the toy on the street, you can play it maybe 1 time, 2 times, and they break, right? But if you buy the stuff in the US, it should last a lot longer, right? Otherwise, if you get that, if people will return it right away, they don't get the money refunded. But in China, you cannot get the money refunded, right? So there's a big mentality issue in China, so you need to make sure you find the right partner for it.
So I think most of my colleagues have really touched upon the key points. I think Jim did a terrific job in listing out all the factors. One of the things that is really key to all this is the cost of quality, right? We tend to kind of ignore that, but cost of quality as a total, or one of the factors in the cost of ownership is critical. One of the things that really I have seen over the years, after having done this for 30 years, one of the things that is critical to building a good product is employees, and employees need to be trained, they need to be looked after. And when you do business with offshore manufacturing partners, those are some of the human aspects of the job that you need to look at now, which are being espoused by EICC and so on, and some of the larger OEMs like Apple. They actually tend to go out and look for factors like that. The other phenomenon that happens is countries that you're doing business with have a different set of holidays. And when they have holidays, they have holidays. They don't take phone calls, they don't take emails, right? And I'm sorry if that's in the middle of your seasonal best sales period, but that's the way it is. Thirdly, the other phenomenon is, especially in Chinese-speaking countries, is Chinese New Year is a big holiday, right? Just before Chinese New Year, all the employees are paid their bonus, which is the 13th month of salary. So, and in the old days, you would see that after the end of the Chinese New Year period, you would lose 20 to 25% of your labor force to somebody else. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that you have 25% of your workers that are new and hence need to be retrained, and all the quality standards adhered to, the documentation understood. Now that rate has certainly gone down over the years, and US manufacturing companies that have plants in Asia have learned to deal with this problem a lot better. But if you deal with local Asian suppliers, this is a huge problem to deal with, and that translates directly into quality, or poor quality, or failures, or reliability, all of that. So that's pretty much, I think, sums it up for TCO.